If you ever visit Japan, people will tell you you have to meet a geisha, or in Kyoto, a keiko. Technically, there are different kinds of traditional entertainers, but most people just call them all geisha. But becoming one is not easy. It takes years of training in music, dance, etiquette, and even conversation. And meeting a top geisha wasn't simple either. You had to be a loyal, trusted patron for years. But today, I'm going to talk about a woman who once trained in this world and would later become Japan's most infamous symbol of love, obsession, and murder. This is the case of Sada Abe, the woman some still call the killer geisha. Let's go back to May 18th, 1936. Sada Abe walks up to a man named Koro Umiya, her lover. She bows deeply, tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," she says over and over. Umiya, thinking maybe she's just guilty about seeing another man, smiles. "It's okay, I understand," he replies. But Abe doesn't stop. She says something that sends chills down his spine. "If you knew what I just did, you would hate me forever." And then, just hours later, police find the mutilated body of Kichizo Ishida, another man Abe had been involved with. The cause of death was strangulation, but that wasn't all. His penis had been cut off, and it was missing. When police started piecing things together, one name kept coming up: Sada Abe, a well-known local hostess. But by then, she had vanished. Even Omiya couldn't find her. The press caught wind of the story the next day. Headlines screamed about the grotesque murder, and rumors started flying. Public interest exploded. Even without the internet, the media frenzy became known as the Sada Abe panic. So what could have led to all this? Why did the case shock so many people so deeply that even decades later, it's still talked about? It all starts with one woman, Sada Abe. She was born in 1905 into a fairly well-off family in Tokyo. She had several siblings, but because of the high child mortality rate at the time, Sada ended up being the youngest surviving child. Maybe that's part of why her parents, especially her mother, treated her a little differently. She was the favorite, and not just in the usual sense. Sada was allowed to do things most other kids couldn't. She skipped school. She spent time taking lessons in singing and music, particularly the shamisen, a Japanese traditional instrument that wasn't exactly considered respectable at the time. Back then, learning the shamisen often meant you were training to become a geisha, or in some cases, entering even less socially accepted lines of work. But that didn't matter to Sada. To her, geisha weren't just entertainers. They were glamorous, confident, and stylish. They were the trendsetters of their time, and Sada wanted that life. She wore bold makeup, dressed differently from other girls her age, and leaned fully into this image. In a way, it was her way of escaping, building an identity that was hers, not just what her family expected of her. But things at home were far from perfect. As problems with her older siblings, especially her brother Shintaro and sister Teruko, got worse, Sada was often the one pushed aside, sent out of the house, told to go somewhere else until things calmed down. And she did. With no one really watching her, she started spending more time outside, falling in with a group of other teens who were also drifting, also figuring things out on their own. They were like her, no real adult guidance, no structure, just kids moving through the city doing what they wanted. At the age of 14, during one of her outings with the group, Abe was raped by one of her acquaintances, a Keio University student. At first, her family publicly supported her. They said they wanted Sada to heal and the perpetrator to be punished. But that changed quickly. Soon they claimed she had become irresponsible and uncontrollable. Their support disappeared just as fast as it came, leaving her to face the fallout on her own. Instead of helping Abe recover from her trauma, her family sold her to a brothel, a geisha house in Yokohama in 1922. Abe's sister Toku said that Sada had always wanted to be a geisha. She loved flashy clothes, music, and spending time with friends. But Sada told a different story. She said it was her father who made the decision to sell her to a brothel as a response to what he saw as her promiscuity. Back then, it wasn't uncommon for families to send their daughters to geisha houses if they were seen as difficult or brought shame to the household. And while geisha might have sounded glamorous, especially to outsiders, many of these places, especially in cities like Yokohama, were closer to brothels than refined training schools. In the end, it was about removing a problem and saving face. For Sada, it was abandonment wrapped in the illusion of opportunity. Also, unlike the glamorous image she once admired, the reality was harsh. Most geisha began training from a very young age, starting out as maiko, young girls who entertained guests before the main geisha arrived. Becoming a respected geisha meant years of strict training in music, dance, and social etiquette, almost like how people train to become idols today. And even after all that, success wasn't guaranteed. For Abe, who entered late and without real support, that path was almost impossible. Despite her early exposure to music and the arts, Sada Abe never seriously trained to become a geisha. For her, it was more of a hobby than a calling, and it showed. She was never promoted beyond the lowest rank. Most of her duties weren't about performing or entertaining. They were about providing sex to low-paying clients. She stayed in that position for 5 years, day after day, the same routine. Eventually, she contracted syphilis, a common risk in licensed prostitution at the time. And under the law, once a prostitute was diagnosed with syphilis, she had to undergo regular physical examinations. It made the job even more grueling, so Sada decided to leave the geisha house and find something better. So she moved to Osaka and began working at the Tobita brothel district, one of the largest legal red light areas in Japan. But her time there didn't go smoothly either. Sada gained a reputation as a troublemaker. She stole money from clients, tried to run away again and again, but each time, the tightly controlled system pulled her back in. It took her 2 years, but eventually she escaped. She took a job as a waitress. The pay was meager, nothing compared to her previous work, so like many women trapped by limited options, she returned to sex work, this time at an unlicensed brothel in Osaka in 1932. A year later, her life took another painful turn. In January 1933, her mother passed away, and her father also passed a year later. Sada returned to Tokyo, first to mourn, then to stay, and while in Tokyo, she re-entered the sex trade. In October 1934, Sada was arrested in a police raid on the unlicensed brothel where she was working, but she wasn't in jail for long. A well-connected acquaintance of the brothel owner, a man named Kinos Kasahara, bailed her out, and just like that, Sada became his mistress. Their relationship was intense. They spent long nights together, tangled in bed, never sleeping. Sada seemed deeply attached. She loved the way he held her, his touch, his attention, at least in the beginning. She wanted more. She asked Kasahara to leave his wife and marry her, but he refused. So she asked if she could take another lover. He refused that too. What started as passion slowly became a prison, and eventually, Sada couldn't take it anymore. She left Kasahara and fled to Nagoya. Later on, when asked about Sada Abe, Kasahara dismissed her cruelly, calling her a whore, a slut, someone who just enjoyed sleeping with men. But Sada remembered it differently. She described her time with him as being like a bird in a cage, not loved, just trapped. To her, it was never freedom, it was control. In 1935, after leaving him, Sada once again worked as a waitress in Nagoya. By then, people described her as warm, sociable, someone with a good personality. It wasn't long before she began seeing a customer named Koro Omiya, a banker and professor with political ambitions. But their relationship was a secret. The restaurant had a strict rule: no romantic involvement between staff and customers. And that, combined with Sada's growing boredom with Nagoya, led her to return to Tokyo. Before leaving, she made a promise to meet Omiya again in the capital. When he learned about her syphilis, he didn't abandon her. Instead, he paid for her to rest and recover at a hot springs resort in Kusatsu from November 1935 to January 1936. One day in January, over snacks and small talk, Omiya suggested she open her own restaurant. It was a chance to start over, become independent. He advised her to gain experience first, work as an apprentice, learn the trade. So on February 1st, 1936, Sada started working at a restaurant called Yoshidaya. The owner, Kichizo Ishida, was 42 and well known in the business. He'd worked his way up, starting as an eel chef. To Sada, he seemed like the perfect mentor. But once she joined, she realized it was his wife who actually ran the place. And Ishida, he was a notorious womanizer. At first, Sada tried to ignore his advances, but her relationship with Omiya had never been physically satisfying, so eventually she gave in. By mid-April, the two had begun a sexual relationship. Sometimes they'd even sleep together in the restaurant, accompanied by love ballads sung by the geisha working there. Sada described Ishida as handsome, charming, and deeply attractive, someone she couldn't resist, especially because he satisfied her in ways no one else had. On April 23, 1936, they agreed to spend a night together at a machiai, a type of tea house used for discreet romantic meetings, the equivalent of a love hotel. They only planned for one night, but they stayed in bed for 4 days. On April 27th, they moved to another machiai, this time in the Hutako Tamagawa area. There, they continued their affair. Even when geisha came in to sing or serve sake, they reportedly didn't stop. For Sada, this wasn't just desire, it was obsession. And soon it would turn into something far more dangerous. Even after days together, it still wasn't enough. Sada and Ishida continued their affair at another machiai in the Ogu neighborhood. Ishida didn't return to his restaurant for 2 weeks, until May 8th. Once it ended, Abe became increasingly unstable. She drank heavily and said she had finally experienced true love. But seeing Ishida back with his wife filled her with rage. If she couldn't have him, no one could. On May 9th, 1936, she watched a play about a geisha stabbing her lover. And it struck a chord. She thought, maybe I could do that to Ishida. Maybe he'd stay. 2 days later, she pawned her clothes, bought a kitchen knife, and confronted him. Holding the blade to his face, she shouted, "You wore that kimono for one of your women. I will kill you for that." Ishida surprisingly smiled. To him, it was just part of their twisted game. They made up and returned to Ogu. Once again, they drank and had sex, but something changed. During one encounter, Abe held the knife to Ishida's genitals and said, "You're mine. I will make sure you never touch another woman." Ishida laughed it off. He thought it was erotic. And they began exploring choking during sex. He encouraged it, and she asked him to do it back. On the night of May 16th, 1936, things went too far. During intercourse, Abe used her obi, the sash from her kimono, to strangle him just as he reached climax. They repeated this over 2 hours. But by the end, Ishida's face was distorted. He was struggling to breathe. In pain, he took sedatives. Before falling asleep, he said, "If you strangle me while I'm sleeping, don't stop. The pain afterwards is worse." And at around 2 a.m. on May 18th, as Ishida lay beside her, asleep and vulnerable, Sada picked up her obi again. She wrapped it around his neck twice and pulled. This time, she didn't stop. She held it there and watched. His body twitched, his breath slowed. Then it stopped, and Sada smiled. Later, she would say, "After I had killed Ishida, I felt totally at ease, as though a heavy burden had been lifted from my shoulders, and I felt a sense of clarity. She lay next to his corpse for hours, holding him like a lover. Finally, as the morning light crept into the room, she took out the kitchen knife. With calm, steady hands, she severed his penis and testicles. She wrapped them carefully in a magazine cover and tucked them into her kimono, close to her heart. And with his blood, she wrote on his thigh and on the bedsheet, Sada Ishida no Kichi, Futari Kiri. Sada and Kichi Ishida, just the two of us. Then she carved the kanji for her name into his left arm. She redressed the body, placed the severed genitals back inside her purse, and left the inn around 8 a.m. Before walking out, she turned to the staff and said, "Please don't disturb him. He's just sleeping." Then she walked away as if nothing had happened. She spent the rest of the day going to a movie, shopping, blending into the city, carrying her lover's remains in her bag. After leaving the inn, Sada Abe went to see her former lover, Koro Omiya. When she saw him, she broke down in tears, gripping his hands, repeating over and over, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." Omiya, unaware of what had happened, assumed she was just apologizing for disappearing, or maybe for being with another man. But in truth, Sada knew the scandal would destroy him. Her apology wasn't for love. It was for the damage she'd already done to his political future. Meanwhile, back at the inn, staff discovered Ishida's lifeless body. His genitals were missing, and the police were notified immediately. By May 19, 1936, newspapers picked up the story. Within hours, the case exploded into the public eye. Abe was identified and linked to Omiya. His career collapsed overnight, and Sada Abe's name became a national obsession. Even without the internet or TV, people crowded around newsstands, desperate for updates. The media frenzy became known as the Abe Sada Panic. One false sighting in Ginza caused mass hysteria and a traffic jam. But while the country searched for her, Sada was quietly hiding in a Shinagawa hotel under a false name. She wasn't trying to escape justice. She was preparing to die. She spent her days drinking beer, getting a massage, writing farewell letters. She planned to kill herself 1 week after the murder on Mount Ikoma in Kansai, holding Ishida's severed genitals in her hand. She later admitted that she had become emotionally attached to them. She would unwrap them from their paper wrapping and gaze at them for hours. She confessed to an attempted act of necrophilia, putting the severed penis into her mouth, saying she couldn't bear to part with it. Only after saying goodbye to it properly, she claimed, could she die in peace. But on May 20th, around 4 p.m., her plan came to an end. The police found her. And she didn't run. She greeted them with a calm smile and said, "Don't be so formal. You're looking for Sada Abe, right? Well, that's me." The officers hesitated. They couldn't believe this soft-spoken, elegant woman was capable of such a crime. So Sada proved it. She reached into her kimono and pulled out the severed penis and testicles, still wrapped in paper. "See," she said, smiling. She was arrested and subjected to 8 rounds of interrogation. When asked why she took Ishida's genitals, she replied, "Because I couldn't take his head or body with me. I wanted to take the part of him that brought back the most vivid memories." Investigators noted her strange calmness. She spoke softly. Her eyes sparkled whenever she talked about Ishida. She seemed at peace, almost joyful when describing the murder. So why did she kill him? Because she wanted him for herself, entirely. They weren't married. And even if they were, she feared he would cheat. Killing him was the only way to ensure no other woman could ever touch him again. When details of the crime were made public, rumors began to spread, particularly about Ishida's anatomy. Some claimed his genitals were unusually large, but officers later dismissed those claims. One even quoted Abe as saying, "Size doesn't matter. What I loved about him was his desire to please me." After her arrest, Ishida's genitals were preserved and stored at Tokyo University Medical School's Pathology Museum. They were reportedly placed on public display after World War II, but today they have vanished without a trace. Sada Abe's first trial took place on November 25, 1936. By 5 a.m., crowds have already gathered outside the courthouse, hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman who had shocked the nation. Even one of the judges reportedly admitted feeling sexually aroused during parts of the trial, particularly when listening to the explicit descriptions of her sexual relationship with Ishida, yet insisted that the trial was handled with full seriousness in a later commentary. In court, Abe was calm and articulate. She expressed regret, not for the murder, but for how the public now saw her. She said what hurt most was that her name had been reduced to that of a perverted woman. I've known men I liked, men I've slept with without taking money, but none of them made me feel like Ishida did. He made me feel like I was truly loved. On December 21, 1936, Sada Abe was convicted of murder and mutilation of a corpse. The prosecution asked for 10 years. Abe herself requested the death penalty. Instead, she was sentenced to 6 years in prison. The short sentence sparked debate. Some believed it was due to psychological factors, that her traumatic past, shaped by prostitution and abandonment, had made her desperate for a love she could fully possess. She was imprisoned at Tochigi Women's Penitentiary, registered as prisoner number 11. On November 10, 1940, her sentence was commuted in honor of Japan's mythical 2600th anniversary. Abe was released on May 17, 1941, exactly 5 years after the murder. After her release, Sada Abe assumed an alias and tried to live quietly, first as the mistress of a man named Wai, moving between Ibaraki and Saitama. But once her identity surfaced, the relationship ended. Post-war Japan was changing fast. The government promoted a 3S policy: sports, screen, and sex, to distract the public from political unrest. In that climate, Abe's story resurfaced, not just as a scandal, but as a symbol. Some framed her as a danger in pre-war writings, like in The Psychological Diagnosis of Sada Abe, which portrayed her as unstable. But others, like writer Ando Sakaguchi, saw her differently, calling her a tender and warm figure of salvation, and a woman who broke free from oppressive norms. In 1947, the book The Erotic Confession of Sada Abe sold over 100,000 copies. Displeased by how it portrayed her, Abe wrote her own memoir the following year. She also toured with a stage play, gave magazine interviews, and was even called a heroine of her time by Monthly Reader for daring to follow her desires in an age of false morality. By the 1950s, she worked in a modest pub in Tokyo, trying to stay out of the spotlight. But people still came just to see Sada Abe. Film critic Donald Ritchie described her dramatic entrances, descending the stairs, staring down gawking customers who nervously joked, "Hide the knives." Her last known appearance was in a 1969 documentary. Then she vanished. In 1970, director Nagisa Oshima tracked her down while preparing his film In the Realm of the Senses. He found her in a nunnery, an old woman far removed from her past. She was also rumored to have been found by Issei's Hagawa, the infamous cannibal killer, though there is no hard proof of this. Still, it fits the pattern: two tabloid legends twisted into cultural myth. And in Japan, where the line between infamy and icon often blurs, their stories became part of a deeper fascination, one with obsession, control, and the extremes of human desire. Sada Abe's story became a touchstone. Scholar Christine L. Marin connected her to the Tokufu, or poisoned woman, a figure used to portray women who defy traditional roles through violence or sexuality. Her confession, raw and unapologetic, became the most circulated female criminal narrative in Japan. She spoke openly of love, lust, and the desperate need to be wanted. And so Abe became one of Japan's earliest examples of the yandere, a woman whose love turns violent, a trope now seen in anime, film, or pop culture. To this day, people argue over how to see her. Some call her a symbol of rebellion, others a tragic figure consumed by trauma and obsession, and some say she was simply a woman who mistook possession for love. But behind the myth, there was pain. It shows how trauma can shape a person's view of love, how a girl hurt and abandoned might grow into a woman desperate to be loved at any cost. And when she finally felt love, she held onto it so tightly that she destroyed it. This wasn't just a love story, it was a tragedy born from deep emotional pain. And in the end, no matter how the world tried to romanticize it, she killed a man. There's nothing to glorify. So what do you think? Was this love twisted by obsession? Did her past lead her there? Do you think justice was truly served? Or has a story like this happened in your country too? Let me know in the comments, and that is all for today. Thanks for watching.